To 8 p.m. last night, there were 44 cases of community transmission. Regrettably, 29 of those were either partially or fully exposed to the community. We are extremely concerned. We need to turn the tide.
The worst day of Sydney's outbreak so far, triggering its toughest restrictions.
Nobody outside your household is allowed into your house. Do not leave your home unless you absolutely have to. That is what a lockdown is.
We really need people to stop moving about. So at the moment, we have over 14,000 close contacts. Now, yesterday it was 7,000.
Levelled up lockdown rules, which kicked in at 5 p.m, include no more than 2 people or a household exercising together and only within 10 kilometres of home. No carpooling with anyone outside your household. Only 1 person per household per day can go shopping for essential items. All auctions and open house inspections are cancelled. And from Sunday, funerals will be limited to 10 people.
What we need is for everybody to follow the rules that are in place. The biggest challenge we have is lack of compliance.
The Premier dispelling any illusions that New South Wales is preparing to live with the virus.
If we chose to live with this, while the rates of vaccination is at 9%, we will see thousands and thousands of hospitalisations and death.
The current Delta outbreak is already responsible for putting more than 1 in 10 of Sydney's confirmed cases into hospital.
We have currently got 43 people in hospital due to COVID, 10 people in ICU, 1 is in their 20s, 1 is in their 30s, 1 is in their 50s, and 5 are in their 60s, and 2 are in their 70s.
So, with so much at stake, can Sydney get on top of this before it turns deadly?
Professor Mary Louise McLaws is an advisor to the WHO and has been calling for tougher restrictions in Sydney for weeks. Mary Louise, those ICU numbers are a real worry. Are deaths in Sydney unavoidable at this point, do you think?
Well, they can be avoided by staying at home and, when you can, get vaccinated. And, of course, having the lockdown done sooner would have avoided all of this.
Mary Louise, these new restrictions, they feel clearer, but do they actually go far enough?
They're much clearer. They should have been as clear as this right at the beginning, and retail needs to be shut down because I think the numbers of contacts that have gone up are signalling that people are using this for a bit of entertainment to get out of the house.
Well, Professor, we hear a lot about how the government is following the health advice, but after 2 weeks of lockdown, 2 weeks of following that health advice, we're now worse than we were at the start of the lockdown. How can we now trust that health advice anymore?
Well, you have to remember that in New South Wales, the Chief Medical Officer gives advice and then it's interpreted politically and economically by her superiors, both the Minister and the Premier. So, in fact, the responsibility lies with them.
Mary Louise, today the Premier blamed the failure of the lockdown so far on Sydney's citizens. Is that entirely fair, do you think?
I don't think it's fair at all. I mean, if this lockdown had have happened at least 3 weeks ago or even 2 weeks ago, and with very, very clear guidelines as they're getting today, plus closure of the retail, we would be in a different position. And Professor Grafton from ANU has a beautiful analysis that short, sharp lockdowns cost less to the economy than what we're going through right now.
Mary Louise, just going back to something you just said about politics being played out here, is there a chance that the Chief Medical Officer has been giving the Premier advice and she hasn't been listening to it?
There is a chance that happens, but sadly we won't know because none of this is transparent. And WHO calls for a great deal of transparency through this crisis. And it would be very interesting to know if the chief health officers around the country were to write their advice and put it up on the web to see how it's interpreted, because each health officer has more clout than others.
And they all seem to conflict as we look back over the last 18 months or so. As always, Mary Louise, great to get your insight on this. Thank you.
stay safe.
You know what I've found hard to watch today? The police going into southwest Sydney. Like, I grew up in Bankstown. My parents live in Bankstown. My whole family's in Bankstown. And I keep thinking of, you know, my very compliant parents who haven't left the house except to go on their walks, sort of opening their doors and just finding police in the streets. You would feel criminalised, right, even though you've done nothing wrong. And I feel like for the most part, people are probably following the health advice. There would be just a few that aren't. And yet all of these suburbs end up kind of demonised and open their doors to cops.
I mean, it's interesting with that stereotyping on postcodes, which it's starting to feel that way, or it's just a failure of messaging, which could also be the case, because the messaging across the board in multiple languages and clarity has really been lacking.
From expert opinions to in-depth analysis and reporting, the Project YouTube brings you the biggest stories from Australia and around the globe. Hit the subscribe button now for news delivered straight to your feed.